In a quiet little neighborhood where the streets were lined with neatly trimmed hedges and colorful flower beds, there lived a family that seemed just like any other. The dad was your typical handyman type, always fixing something around the house or tinkering with his old car in the driveway. His wife had a calm and warm presence, the kind of person who made everyone feel welcome. And then there was their son, a bright-eyed young man who had recently come back home after finishing college. He wasn't sure what he wanted to do next. So for now, he was living with his parents while figuring things out. Life in this cozy suburban bubble was peaceful until one day it wasn't. You see, every neighborhood has its share of characters, and this one was no exception. There was one particular neighbor, let's call her Karen, who fancied herself as the unofficial guardian of all things proper in the area. She took pride in making sure everyone followed the rules set by the Homeowners Association, HOA, whether they liked it or not. To Karen, these weren't just guidelines. They were commandments carved in stone. Now, when the family's son moved back in, things started changing around the house. A couple of extra cars appeared in the driveway, because the kid had brought some of his stuff from college. Boxes piled up on the porch as he unpacked, and occasionally you'd catch him skateboarding down the driveway for fun. None of this was a big deal to most people, but to Karen, oh, it was practically a crime scene. One sunny afternoon, Karen marched over to the family's house, her face set in that classic scowl she reserved for rule breakers. She knocked on the door, tapping her foot impatiently until the dad answered. Without wasting a second, she launched into her speech about how the neighborhood standards were being compromised. Extra cars? Not okay. Skateboarding? Absolutely. Unacceptable. And those boxes on the porch? They were an eyesore. The dad listened patiently, nodding here and there, but eventually he asked Karen politely to leave their property. After all, they weren't doing anything illegal, they were just living their lives. But Karen didn't stop there. No, sir. She decided to take matters into her own hands and called the local authorities, claiming there was suspicious activity. At the house, suspicious activity. Can you believe it? All because a grown-up kid moved back in with his folks. Little did Karen know, her little stunt was about to blow up in her face in ways she couldn't have imagined. While she stood smugly by her mailbox the next day, waiting for drama to unfold, two sheriff's deputies pulled up in front of the family's house. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, curious to see what would happen. Was someone really breaking the law? Or was this just another overreaction from Karen? As the deputies stepped out of their car, the dad greeted them with a mix of confusion and concern. He explained that everything happening at their place was completely normal. They were just helping their son settle in. Nothing shady, nothing illegal. But then something strange happened. The mom walked up to join the conversation, introducing herself with a calm yet commanding tone. One of the deputies froze mid-sentence, his hand instinctively snapping into a salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice filled with respect. The dad blinked in surprise, unsure what was going on. And Karen? Well, her jaw hit the floor. What none of the neighbors, not even nosy Karen, knew was that this seemingly ordinary mom wasn't so ordinary after all. She was a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve, currently working closely with the county sheriff's department. Her presence alone commanded respect, and the deputies recognized her rank immediately. For Karen, this revelation was like a punch to the gut. She had spent so much energy trying to assert control over the neighborhood, only to find herself standing face to face with someone far more authoritative than she could ever dream of being. Suddenly, her complaints sounded petty and ridiculous, even to her own ears. As the deputies apologized to the family and assured them everything was fine, Karen realized she might have bitten off more than she could chew. This moment marked the beginning of a chain reaction that would change the Dynamics of the entire neighborhood. Little did anyone know, the real story was just getting started. The scene outside the family's house was buzzing with quiet curiosity. Neighbors who had been minding their own business just moments ago were now glued to their windows, pretending to water plants or check their mail while secretly watching what was unfolding. Karen stood a few feet away from her mailbox, arms crossed tightly over her chest, wearing an expression that screamed victory. She had called the cops, after all. Who wouldn't feel smug about that? In her mind, she was the hero of the neighborhood, standing up for order and decorum against the so-called chaos next door. But things weren't going quite as Karen expected. The two deputies walked up to the dad, who was standing in the driveway, looking puzzled. He greeted them warmly but couldn't hide his confusion. "Is everything okay, officers?" he asked, scratching the back of his neck. One of the deputies nodded and explained they'd received a report about suspicious activity at the house. Suspicious activity? That phrase hung in the air like a bad smell. The dad tilted his head, clearly taken aback. Suspicious activity? He repeated, glancing toward the porch where a few unpacked boxes still sat. What exactly seemed suspicious? His tone wasn't angry, it was calm, almost amused, but it carried a hint of disbelief. He went on to explain how his son had recently moved back home temporarily after finishing college. They were helping him settle in, and yes, there might be a couple more cars parked outside than usual, but nothing out of the ordinary. Just a typical family adjusting to life changes. As the dad spoke, his wife walked out of the house. She had heard the commotion and decided to see what was going on. Dressed casually in jeans and a simple blouse, she didn't look like someone who could command attention without even trying. But when she stepped forward and introduced herself to the deputies, something shifted in the atmosphere. Her voice was steady, warm, yet firm, like she knew exactly who she was and didn't need to prove anything to anyone. "Hi, I'm Mom," she said, extending her hand. "Can I help clarify anything?" One of the deputies froze mid-handshake. For a split second, his eyes widened before snapping into a crisp salute. "Ma'am," he said, his voice suddenly filled with respect. The other deputy quickly followed suit, standing straighter as if someone had flipped the switch inside them. Both men looked at her not just as a concerned homeowner anymore, but as someone whose authority far exceeded theirs in certain circles. The dad blinked, staring at his wife like he'd never seen her before. Sure, he knew she was impressive. How could he not? But this reaction from the deputies caught him off guard. Meanwhile, Karen's jaw dropped so low it practically hit the sidewalk. What on earth was happening? Why were these officers saluting a woman who lived right here in this sleepy little neighborhood? To Karen, it felt like the ground beneath her feet was crumbling. This wasn't supposed to happen. She was the one holding all the cards, or so she thought. Once the initial shock wore off, the mom smiled slightly and returned the gesture with a polite nod. Then, turning her focus back to the matter at hand, she calmly explained the situation again. She described how her son had come home after graduation and was staying with them temporarily while job hunting. Everything happening at their house was normal, routine even. There was no wrongdoing, no threat to the community. It was just life playing out as it often does. The deputies listened intently, nodding along. When she finished speaking, one of them turned to the dad and offered an apology. "We're sorry for the misunderstanding," he said sincerely. "We'll make sure to address this with whoever filed the complaint." As he spoke, his gaze flickered briefly toward Karen, who was frozen in place like a deer caught in headlights. Everyone could tell by now that she was the one behind the call. There was no denying it. Karen tried to compose herself, stepping closer to interject. "Well, I only wanted to ensure the neighborhood stays safe," she stammered, her voice wavering. She sounded defensive, almost guilty, though she desperately tried to mask it. The mom turned to look at her, her expression unreadable. For a moment, no one said anything. The silence stretched long enough to make Karen squirm uncomfortably, under the weight of unspoken judgment. Finally, the mom broke the tension with a soft but deliberate statement. "I understand your concerns," she said, her tone measured. "But sometimes assumptions can lead to unnecessary trouble. Let's talk later, okay?" It wasn't a question, it was a promise wrapped in politeness. Karen nodded weakly, unable to muster any of her usual bravado. Whatever confidence she had marched up to the house with had evaporated completely as the deputies wrapped up their conversation and prepared to leave. The neighbors who had been eavesdropping slowly retreated back into their homes. Some exchanged knowing glances, whispering about what they just witnessed. Others simply shook their heads, marveling at how quickly the tables had turned. Word spread fast in small neighborhoods like this one, and it wasn't long before everyone knew about the mysterious mom who earned instant respect from law enforcement. Back inside the house, the family gathered around the kitchen table, still processing what had happened. The dad chuckled, shaking his head. "I mean, I always knew you were amazing, but wow," he said, grinning at his wife. She laughed softly, brushing off the compliment. "It's not about me," she replied. "It's about setting the record straight. We didn't do anything wrong, and we shouldn't have to defend ourselves for living our lives." Their son chimed in too, joking about how cool it was to see the cop salute his mom. "Guess I'll think twice before skateboarding down the driveway again," he teased, earning laughter from the rest of the family. Despite the absurdity of the situation, they managed to find humor in it. After all, life is full of surprises, and this was definitely one for the books. Outside, Karen lingered near her mailbox for a while longer, replaying the events in her mind. She had started the day feeling powerful, convinced she was doing the right thing by reporting the family. Now, she felt small and exposed, like everyone in the neighborhood was silently judging her. Even worse, she realized she might have underestimated the very people she accused. Who were they, really? And why hadn't anyone told her about the mom's background? For the first time in a long time, Karen found herself questioning her actions. Was she truly protecting the neighborhood, or was she just stirring up drama where none existed? The answers didn't come easily, and the weight of her choices settled heavily on her shoulders. Little did she know, this incident would spark a chain reaction that would change not only her perspective, but also the dynamics of the entire community. And so, the story continued to unfold, leaving everyone wondering, what happens when power meets humility and assumptions collide with reality? The next morning, the neighborhood buzzed with quiet whispers. Neighbors who had been peeking through their curtains the day before were now openly talking about what happened. Some felt embarrassed for jumping to conclusions based on Karen's accusations, while others couldn't stop marveling at the mom's calm authority. Word spread like wildfire. She wasn't just any suburban mom, she was a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. That revelation alone changed how people saw her and, by extension, the entire situation. Karen, however, was having a much harder time processing everything. She spent most of the night tossing and turning, replaying the events over and over. In her mind, the image of those deputies snapping to attention, saluting her neighbor as if she were royalty, haunted her. It wasn't just embarrassment, it was shame. For years, Karen had prided herself on being the voice of reason in the neighborhood, the one who kept everyone in line. But now? Now she wondered if she'd gone too far this time. True to her word, the mom decided it was time to have a conversation. With Karen, she didn't storm over angrily or demand an apology. Instead, she chose a calm and deliberate approach. Early that afternoon, dressed in simple clothes but carrying herself with unmistakable confidence, she walked up to Karen's front door and knocked firmly. When Karen opened the door, her usual bravado faltered instantly. Her face turned pale, and she fumbled for words. "Hi," the mom said, her tone polite but firm. "Can we talk for a minute?" Karen hesitated, glancing behind her as if searching for an escape route, but eventually stepped aside to let her in. They sat down in Karen's living room, the air thick with tension. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then the mom broke the silence. "I wanted to clear the air," she began, her voice steady. "I understand you're concerned about keeping the neighborhood safe and orderly. I get that, I really do. But calling the police because my son moved back home? That's not protecting the neighborhood. That's causing unnecessary drama." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, avoiding eye contact. I only meant to ensure things were okay," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "It looked unusual, and I thought—" "You thought wrong," the mom interrupted gently but firmly. "When you involve law enforcement without a valid reason, you waste their time and hours. And frankly, it creates distrust among neighbors. Is that really what you want?" Karen swallowed hard, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. She had always pictured herself as the hero of the story, the one looking out for everyone else, but now she realized she might have been the villain all along. The mom continued, her words measured but impactful. "This isn't about punishing you or making you feel bad," she said. "It's about understanding the bigger picture. Communities thrive when people respect each other, not when they try to control every little detail. Rules are important, yes, but so is compassion. If something seems off, maybe knock on the door and ask questions instead of jumping to conclusions." Karen nodded slowly, tears welling up in her eyes. She hadn't expected this kind of grace from someone she had essentially accused of wrongdoing. Most people would have retaliated or demanded justice, but here was this woman sitting across from her, offering wisdom instead of anger. It was humbling and uncomfortable. By the end of the conversation, Karen looked visibly shaken. She promised to think twice before taking similar actions in the future, though she couldn't bring herself to apologize outright. The mom didn't push her. Instead, she stood up, thanked Karen for listening, and left without another word. As she walked back to her house, she felt a sense of closure. She had done what needed to be done, not out of revenge, but out of a desire to foster understanding. Over the following days, Karen became noticeably quieter around the neighborhood. She still attended HOA meetings, but her once overbearing presence softened. She stopped nitpicking minor infractions, like slightly overgrown grass or holiday decorations left up past January. Slowly but surely, she began to change, or at least tried to. For the rest of the neighbors, the incident served as a wake-up call. Conversation shifted from gossip to reflection. Many admitted they had blindly trusted Karen's judgment without questioning whether her complaints were justified. Others expressed admiration for the mom, not just because of her military background, but because of how she handled the situation with dignity and poise. Even those who had initially sided with Karen found themselves reevaluating their stance. The dad and his son noticed the shift, too. People who rarely spoke to them before started waving hello or stopping by for casual chats. One neighbor even dropped off a plate of cookies with a note that read, "Thanks for reminding us what community spirit is all about." It was a small gesture, but it meant a lot. As for the mom, she remained humble throughout it all. She never sought recognition or used her position to intimidate anyone. In fact, she went out of her way to reassure Karen and others that she harbored no ill will. During a community barbecue a few weeks later, She struck up a friendly conversation with Karen, asking about her garden and complimenting her flower arrangements. It was a subtle olive branch, and Karen accepted it gratefully. Still, the ripple effects of the confrontation lingered. The neighborhood began to feel different, not perfect, but more connected. People started attending block parties and community events more often, eager to rebuild trust and strengthen bonds. Even Karen made an effort to engage, though it took her some time to shake off her old habits completely. One evening, as the family sat together on their porch watching the sunset, the dad leaned back in his chair and sighed contentedly. "You know," he said, glancing at his wife, "this whole mess turned into something good, didn't it?" She smiled softly, nodding. "Sometimes life gives us opportunities to grow even when we don't expect them." Their son chimed in, grinning. "Yeah, and who knew moving back home would cause such a scene?" They all laughed, enjoying the moment. Despite the chaos that had unfolded, they felt grateful for the lessons learned, not just by Karen, but by everyone involved. Because in the end, it wasn't about winning or losing. It was about finding common ground and remembering that communities are built on kindness, not control. And somewhere down the street, Karen watched the family from her window, a faint smile tugging at the corners of her lips. Change wasn't easy, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. The weeks that followed the confrontation between the mom and Karen brought subtle yet noticeable changes to the neighborhood. It wasn't anything dramatic, there were no parades or grand declarations, but the air felt lighter, less tense. People seemed more willing to smile at each other, to strike up conversations they might have avoided before. The incident had acted like a mirror, forcing everyone to take a long, hard look at themselves and their roles in the community. Karen, for her part, was trying. Really trying. She still attended HOA meetings, but instead of dominating the discussions with complaints about minor infractions, she sat quietly, listening more than speaking. At first, her silence unnerved some neighbors. They were so used to her sharp critiques that her absence from debates felt almost unnatural. But over time, they realized it wasn't just silence. It was reflection. Karen was learning to pick her battles, to weigh whether something truly mattered before making a fuss. One day, during one of these meetings, someone raised a concern about the new family who had recently moved into the neighborhood. Their grass was a little patchy, and their mailbox leaned slightly to one side. Normally, this would have been Karen's cue to launch into a tirade about property values and curb appeal. But this time, she stayed quiet. When pressed by another neighbor for her opinion, she hesitated before saying softly, "Maybe we should give them a chance to settle in first. Everyone needs time to adjust." The room fell silent for a moment. Then, slowly, heads began nodding in agreement. Even Karen herself looked surprised by her own words. It was as if she'd taken the advice the mom had given her to think twice before jumping to conclusions and applied it here. For the first time in years, Karen didn't feel the need to micromanage every detail of the neighborhood. Instead, she focused on what truly mattered: being a good neighbor. Meanwhile, the mom continued going about her life as usual. She didn't flaunt her military background or use it to intimidate anyone, but word of her rank and accomplishments spread organically. Neighbors who once saw her as just another friendly face now regarded her with a mix of admiration and respect. Some even approached her for advice, not just about HOA matters, but about personal challenges too. Whether it was dealing with unruly teenagers or navigating workplace conflicts, people found comfort in her calm demeanor and practical wisdom. Her husband noticed the shift too. "You're kind of becoming the unofficial mayor around here," he joked one evening as they sat together on the porch. She laughed, brushing off the comment. "I'm just living my life," she replied. "If people want to talk, I'll listen. That's all." Their son, who had initially planned to stay only temporarily, decided to extend his time at home. He enjoyed the sense of belonging he felt in the neighborhood, especially after seeing how warmly people embraced him and his family following the incident. He started joining local events, a pickup basketball game here, a volunteer cleanup day there, and quickly became a familiar face around town. His presence added a youthful energy to the community, bridging the gap between older residents and younger newcomers. As summer rolled in, the neighborhood hosted its annual block party. Strings of colorful lights hung between trees, music played softly in the background, and tables groaned under the weight of homemade dishes. It was the kind of event that brought everyone together, from toddlers chasing bubbles to grandparents swapping stories in lawn chairs. The atmosphere buzzed with laughter and camaraderie, a stark contrast to the tension that had gripped the area just months earlier. Karen arrived late, clutching a plate of cookies wrapped in plastic wrap. She hovered near the edge of the crowd, unsure where to go or what to do. Part of her worried that people might still hold grudges, that they'd whisper behind her back or exclude her from conversations. But as she scanned the gathering, she saw smiles and waves directed her way. Encouraged, she stepped forward, heading straight for the mom, or rather, the colonel. "Hi," Karen said awkwardly, holding out the plate of cookies. "I, made these. Thought you might like them." The mom accepted the gesture with a warm smile. "Thank you," she said sincerely. "That's very kind of you." There was no trace of judgment in her voice, no lingering resentment, just genuine appreciation. For Karen, that simple exchange meant the world. It was forgiveness without fanfare, acceptance without conditions. As she walked away, she felt a weight lift off her shoulders, a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. Maybe she hadn't fixed everything overnight, but she was working on it. And that was enough. Throughout the evening, Karen mingled more freely than she had in years. She complimented a neighbor's gardening skills, chatted with parents about school programs, and even laughed at a joke told by the teenager running the DJ booth. By the end of the night, she found herself sitting beside the mom again, sipping lemonade and talking about books they both enjoyed. It was surreal, almost dreamlike, to think that just a few months ago, they had been on opposite sides of a heated conflict. As the block party wound down and neighbors began packing up, the dad stood by the grill, flipping the last few burgers. Someone asked him how he managed to keep things peaceful despite the drama earlier in the year. He shrugged, a wry grin spreading across his face. "Honestly, it's not me, it's her," he said, nodding toward his wife. "She has this way of turning tough situations into teachable moments, and honestly, we're lucky to have her." His words echoed what many others were thinking. The mom wasn't just a neighbor. She was a force for good, someone who inspired those around her to be better versions of themselves. Her actions weren't flashy or self-serving. They were rooted in empathy, patience, and integrity. And while she never sought recognition, her impact was undeniable. By the time the stars came out and the final guests left, the neighborhood felt different, not because of any single act, but because of countless small ones. Conversations flowed more easily. Smiles came more naturally. Trust, once fractured, was slowly being rebuilt. Karen returned home that night feeling lighter, freer. She placed the empty cookie plate on her counter and stared at it for a moment, remembering the warmth in the mom's eyes when she'd handed it over. For the first time in a long time, Karen allowed herself to believe that change was possible, not just for others, but for her too. And as she drifted off to sleep, she thought about the future, not with fear or uncertainty, but with hope, because sometimes even the smallest steps toward understanding can lead to the biggest transformations. Months had passed since the incident that shook the neighborhood, and life had settled into a comfortable rhythm. The once tense atmosphere was now replaced with a sense of ease, quiet understanding among neighbors that they were all in this together. People weren't perfect, but they were trying, and sometimes that was enough. Karen, in particular, had undergone a transformation that no one could have predicted, not even herself. She still cared about maintaining standards in the neighborhood, but her approach had softened significantly. Instead of storming over to someone's house to demand compliance, she'd knock politely and ask if everything was okay. If a lawn looked a little unkempt or a driveway cluttered, she resisted the urge to call it out publicly. Instead, she reminded herself of what the mom had said during their conversation. Compassion matters more than control. One crisp autumn morning, Karen woke up early, brewed herself a cup of coffee, and stepped outside to enjoy the cool breeze. As she sipped her drink, she noticed the mom walking down the street, heading toward the community garden where several neighbors gathered every Saturday to tend to shared plots. Karen hesitated for a moment before deciding to join her. It wasn't something she would have done before. Gardening wasn't exactly her thing, but she figured it wouldn't hurt to see what all the fuss was about. When she arrived, the mom greeted her warmly, handing her a pair of gloves. "Thought you might want to give it a try," she said with a smile. Karen nodded, feeling both nervous and excited. Over the next hour, she found herself knee-deep in soil, planting bulbs alongside other neighbors. They chatted casually about everything from upcoming holidays to funny pet stories. For Karen, it felt strange yet refreshing to connect with people in such an unguarded way. By the end of the morning, her hands were dirty, her back ached slightly, but she wore a genuine smile, one that came from simply being part of something bigger than herself. That same afternoon, the neighborhood buzzed with activity as kids played tag in cul-de-sacs and parents set up picnic blankets under shade trees. The dad sat on his porch, tinkering with an old radio he picked up at a garage sale. His son joined him, tossing a football back and forth while sharing updates about his job search. Things were looking promising. He'd landed a few interviews recently, and optimism filled the air. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the mom walked over to sit beside them. She carried 3 glasses of lemonade, handing one each to her husband and son. "You know," she said thoughtfully, gazing at the scene around them, "this place feels different now, better." Her husband chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. "Yeah, we've come a long way since the whole cop drama. Who knew calling the sheriff could lead to so much good?" Their son grinned, nodding in agreement. "I guess sometimes chaos leads to clarity." The mom laughed softly, leaning back in her chair. "It's not just chaos, it's growth. Everyone here has grown, including Karen. I think she's finally realizing that communities aren't built on rules alone. They're built on trust, kindness, and the willingness to listen." Speaking of Karen, she happened to be strolling by at that exact moment, pushing her dog in a stroller. When she saw the family on the porch, she waved shyly. The mom waved back, inviting her to join them. Karen hesitated briefly before crossing the street and settling onto the edge of the porch steps. "Beautiful evening, isn't it?" The mom sighed, offering Karen a glass of lemonade. "It really is," Karen replied, accepting the drink with a small smile. There was a pause, then she added, almost timidly, "I just wanted to say thank you for everything. You didn't have to be so patient with me, but you were. And I've learned a lot because of it." The sincerity in Karen's voice caught everyone off guard, even herself. She hadn't planned to say those words, but they spilled out naturally, like a weight she'd been carrying finally lifting. The mom reached over and patted her hand gently. "We all make mistakes," she said. "What matters is how we grow from them." For Karen, hearing those words was like closure wrapped in warmth. She stayed a little longer, chatting with the family about random topics, the weather, The upcoming holiday season, the neighbor's cat that kept sneaking into gardens. It was nothing extraordinary, but it was real, authentic, and for Karen, that made all the difference. As the days turned into weeks, the neighborhood continued to thrive. Block parties became regular occurrences, drawing crowds of all ages. Kids raced bikes through the streets while adults grilled burgers and swapped stories. Even Karen started hosting small gatherings at her house, inviting neighbors over for tea and dessert. Slowly but surely, she was becoming less of an enforcer and more of a friend. One evening, during a particularly lively get-together, the mom stood near the food table, watching the scene unfold with a content expression. A neighbor approached her, holding 2 plates of brownies. "You know," he said, glancing around at the happy faces, "you changed things around here. Not just for Karen, but for all of us." She shook her head, brushing off the compliment. "I didn't change anything. We all did. Together." He smiled, nodding in agreement. "Still, it's nice to have someone who reminds us what really matters." By the time winter rolled around, the neighborhood was unrecognizable from the tense, divided place it had been earlier in the year. Snow-blanketed rooftops and lawns and strings of lights twinkled merrily in windows. Neighbors shoveled each other's driveways without being asked, left care packages on doorsteps, and bundled up for sledding adventures in the park. It was proof that even the coldest months could feel warm when hearts were open. On New Year's Eve, the community gathered for a bonfire in the cul-de-sac. Hot chocolate flowed freely, marshmallows toasted over flames, and laughter echoed into the night. As midnight approached, everyone counted down together, cheering loudly as fireworks lit up the sky. Amid the celebration, Karen stood beside the mom, their shoulders brushing lightly. "Happy New Year," Karen said quietly, raising her mug of cocoa in a toast. "Happy New Year," the mom replied, clinking her mug against Karen's. "Here's to new beginnings for all of us." And as the clock struck 12, signaling the start of a fresh year, the neighborhood embraced the promise of tomorrow. They weren't perfect. They never would be. But they were learning, growing, becoming better versions of themselves. One day at a time, because in the end, that's what communities are all about, finding strength in each other, forgiving mistakes, and building bridges instead of walls. And in this little corner of suburbia, they had done just that, not perfectly, but beautifully.